Well, it's time. So, Talafalava, kia ora, kia orana, malo elelei, mula vinaka, yakoi, pakalofala yatu. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining in once again for today's training session delivered to you by the Pacific Learning Partnership for Environmental and Social Sustainability. I see many familiar faces that joined yesterday. I want to also thank you for joining yesterday's really great presentation from the World Bank folks. Today's session is on module 14. It's on environmental monitoring and management plans, or EMMP. So we have some excellent trainers lined up for you today from the Asian Development Bank. My colleagues Jean Williams and Alan Sewell, who are joining us from New Zealand, and they'll be leading the training session today. I'll read to you a little bit of the narrative behind this topic. Obviously, these were also chosen from the evaluation last time, from the first round. So EMMP, or Environmental Monitoring and Management Plan, is a key component of a successful ESIA or EIA. However, all too often, it is poorly designed or incomplete and submitted only as a draft with the EIA for approval. Now, EMMP should form the basis for approving developments and setting approval conditions. It is also how EIA regulators can measure the success of developers and operators' mitigation management plans. Therefore, it is important to understand what goes into a good EMMP and how to implement them. So today, I'll just hand over to Mr. Alan Sewell from ADP, who will take over our training session now. Alan, are you able to put your PowerPoint presentation on the screen, please?
Yes, I'll just do that now.
All right, thank you very much. Over to you, Alan.
Okay. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great.
Yes, can see that.
Okay, in this session, welcome everybody, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. In this session, we're going to be focusing on environmental management planning related to the construction stage of the project cycle. Now, just before we get underway, I have a list of acronyms which I hope those of you have received these, because in this presentation we'll use quite a number of acronyms. So I've got this list here, and it would be useful to have these beside you while we go through this presentation. And just a note on some of the terminology we use. Some of the terminology that are used for environmental management plan or environmental management and monitoring plan, depending on what particular organization is funding the project. You might have for example, ADB uses EMP, Environmental Management Plan. World Bank can use Environmental Management and Monitoring Plan. Basically means the same thing. When we're talking about Environmental Impact Assessment, ADB tends to use EIA or IEE, Initial Environmental Examination. World Bank's equivalent is Environmental and Social Impact Assessment. But basically, they're the same things. So there will be a number of areas here where the terminology will be slightly different, and as we come across those, I will just refresh your memory of that. But anyway, here are the list of acronyms. I'm not going to go through these at the moment, but we'll come across them, and I will certainly read them out in full as we come across them. So the objectives of today's session are two key objectives. Originally, we had 3 objectives. But we've narrowed it down just to 2, because the third objective, which is roles and responsibility, we feel that that would be better suited to the next week's presentation when we look at compliance management and reporting. So today, we're specifically looking at how the Environmental Management Plan, or EMMP, is developed throughout the EIA or ESIA process to approval and consent. And we will define what we mean by the Environmental Management Plan first and set the context. In particular, we'll explain where the Environmental Management Plan development sits in the project cycle, how it is used as part of the consent and approval conditions, and then we'll go through a case study applying a risk assessment methodology in the development of the EMP for the South Parae Domestic Wharf Reconstruction Project in Port Vila, Vanuatu. Now, the second objective is how to ensure that the EMP is implemented, and the importance of the Construction Environmental Management Plan, or Construction Environmental and Social Management Plan if you're from World Bank. So CEMP or CESMP means the same thing. It's one thing to have a really good environmental management plan, but it's quite a different thing to ensure that it is implemented. So our second objective will be to look at how can we ensure that the environmental management plan is implemented effectively. And in doing so, we'll look at the importance of bid and contract documentation, the importance of the construction environmental management plan and how it needs to be developed from the environmental management plan. And we'll go through an example of CEMP development for the Port Vila Bowerfield Airport Runway Rehabilitation Project. This was a project funded by World Bank, whereas the one that we're looking at for the environmental management plan, the case study, is an ADB financed project, the South Parae Wharf. So let's set the context of the construction stage within the project cycle. Oh no, first, before we do that, let's define what we mean by an environmental management plan. Well, environmental management plan is a plan that translates proposed mitigation measures into practice, and it is typically developed as part of an environmental assessment. And in fact, any EIA or ESIA, if you prefer to use that, would not be complete without an environmental management plan, or if you want to say an environmental management and monitoring plan. Either way, no EIA, ESIA would be complete without one of these plans. So the environmental management plan necessarily needs to include a summary of project approvals, permits and conditions as part of the country regulatory system. Secondly, a summary of significant environmental and social impacts and risks and mitigation measures. Thirdly, actions to be undertaken to implement each mitigation measure. And this includes procedures for monitoring environmental quality to meet various targets or standards. Fourthly, a monitoring program, including audits and corrective actions reporting. Fifthly, continued community engagement, which is a significant part of ongoing environmental management planning. Sixthly, institutional organizational arrangements for EMP implementation. In other words, who will do what, who's responsible for what and when during the EMP implementation. And finally, the implementation schedule and the cost estimates for the environmental management plan. So let's look here, look at the project cycle. The development of the environmental management plan is developed throughout the project cycle as part of the EIA process. Now, this is quite an important diagram. The project cycle consists of 6 stages. This is a typical project cycle that's funded by World Bank or Asian Development Bank or some other funder. We've got 6 stages and 2 main phases. So stage 1 is project identification, and stage 2, project preparation and assessment. That is generally called the preparation phase in the project cycle. And stages 3 to 5 is called the implementation phase. Now, I've given you a summary. I think I've sent you a printout of a summary of key environmental management planning activities at each stage. And this is just some background for you, some context. And it's not something that we're going to go through in detail at the moment, but it's important background information as we go through this process. And this detail that you have sent to you is very useful in understanding the various safeguards activities that need to be undertaken at each stage of the project cycle. And in this module, we'll be focusing particularly on the environmental safeguards and to some extent, the social safeguards. But it's important that you all understand that there are various other safeguards activities that are undertaken in parallel with the environmental and social. And we will be touching on some of those other activities. So the handout is very important for the context. So on ADB funded projects, for example, the preparation phase is often undertaken as a grant. That's stages 1 and 2, the feasibility study. The funder prepares the concept and preliminary design, including the safeguards and economic analysis, etc. Once prepared, the funder and the government decide whether or not to proceed with implementation. This is the decision to proceed or not. This is after stage 2. Typically, this decision is made following the feasibility study preliminary design. If the feasibility study meets the requirements of the financing institution in terms of cost, environmental, social, and economic requirements according to their various policies and safeguards policies, and it agrees with the country's requirements, and it comes to an agreement with these requirements, then typically a loan is signed and the project commences implementation. And that's where we go from stage 3. There are some variations in there, but typically this is the procedure. From stage 3 is when a decision is made, funding is being provided, whoever's providing the funding, and then detailed design will start and the project will start to be implemented. So implementation involves a detailed design, pre-construction and construction. So let's look in more detail as to how the EMP is developed and implemented through these various stages. So stage 1, this is the preliminary stage, the project identification stage. This is where an initial decision to proceed to project preparation is made and a general understanding of the concept. So during stage 1, what occurs is there is initial risk assessment, screening. Asian Development Bank, for example, screens the project and categorizes it in terms of the level of impacts it's likely, that project is likely to result in. A high level of impact or complex project would be given a category A, where a full environmental impact assessment is required. A project that is more localized impacts will have some impacts, but these are all readily mitigatable, would be categorized as a category B, and under ADB's system, a lower level of assessment, initial environmental examination would be undertaken. So this is what happens. The projects are categorized at this project identification stage. At the same time, there is engagement with the regulatory agencies, your Department of Environment, and a discussion is held with them as to what their requirements are in terms of the country system, because none of the funders will go ahead with any project unless it's compliant with the country system. And also at this stage, the terms of reference are usually prepared for either the initial environmental examination or the EISA. This is what happens in the stage 1. And then the milestone that completes the stage 1 stage is a decision to proceed with project preparation. And then during stage 2, this is where your initial feasibility study is undertaken in terms of the design, preliminary design for the project is prepared during the project preparation phase. And at the same time, you have your risk identification and analysis, and that's where your draft, your initial IEE and your draft EIA is undertaken, and your first draft of the environmental management plan is completed as part of the environmental assessment process, assessing the preliminary design. So this happens in stage 2. And the milestone to complete stage 2 is then a decision to proceed with the project or not. So now moving on to stage 3, what happens here? At the end of stage 2, the funders and the government have come to an agreement that yes, they're going to go ahead with the project, and a loan is decided, or whatever funding arrangement is decided, and then they will then proceed to undertake the detailed design and engineering and also procurement. And at that stage, the EIA is then reviewed, and it's updated the EIA and the environmental management plan that was prepared during the project preparation phase, during the preliminary design phase. It is then reviewed and updated along with the detailed design, because typically what happens is during the detailed design, things change. You have an initial feasibility study, an initial preliminary design, but often when you get into the detailed design, sometimes things change. And as for example, the footprint of the project might change, the methodology might change as they go into detailed design. And therefore, the EIA and EMP have to be updated to be relevant to the new design or the new footprint. So it's very important that at stage 3, the environmental management plan, along with the environmental assessment, is updated based on the detailed design. So your finished product is not at the end of the feasibility stage. It's not at the end of the preliminary design. Your finished product is getting closer during the detailed design stage. So you can see how it's developing. The environmental management plan is developing. And during this stage, during the detailed design stage, that's where you obtain your various environmental licenses or consents or permits from your CSS, which is a country safeguard system. In other words, your regulator, your environmental, your Department of Environment, all of those country licenses and consents or approvals that are required. This happens as during the detailed design process, and it's based on the detailed design. And then the environmental management plan, the updated environmental management plan, and the consent conditions are then included into the bid and contract documents during the procurement phase. So the milestone for the end of stage 3 is that construction contracts are awarded. And then we move into stage 4. This is the contractor he's won the contract, but he hasn't got to site yet. This is a very important stage. We call it the pre-construction phase. It's when the contract has been signed, but it's before the contractor actually sets foot on site, before he starts putting his machinery, before he starts clearing any ground. This is a very important step, the pre-construction, very important stage, the pre-construction stage. And during that stage, this is where the contractor then develops his CEMP, or Construction Environmental Management Plan, or Construction Environmental and Social Management Plan, whatever you want to call it. This is when he develops that based on the EIA and the EMP, and it reflects his approach and methodology as per his construction schedule. So you can see how we've started with an environmental management plan during the feasibility study, been updated during the detailed design, and then in the pre-construction phase, the contractor then takes that detailed, that updated environmental management plan, and then looks at how his methodology, and then updates it in terms of his construction methodology. And that's what we call the Construction Environmental Management Plan. And we'll be looking at that further down in more detail, just what the difference is between the two. And a key point in the pre-construction phase is that the works must not commence before the Construction Environmental Management Plan is reviewed and cleared. It's a very important point, and we'll be emphasizing that as we go through. So the milestone for the end of stage 4 is the commencement of construction. Any questions just before we go on from here? We're going to move on to the case study and go through this case study from Vanuatu, where of just giving you a methodology for how to develop an environmental management plan. So any questions so far on the project cycle and what I've just discussed?
Thanks, Alan. We've got a comment here from our acting director for Environmental Management Governance Program in SPREP, Mr. Chopeta Vitsanivalu. Over to you.
Alan, excellent presentation indeed, and I totally support and agree with your last point, which is very, very important, that a CEMP must be approved before any commences. Because in my experience, Alan, sometimes when developers receive the approval of the EIA, they thought that they can go ahead. But thank you again for strongly emphasizing that point. Thank you. Thank you, Alan.
I'm monitoring the chat box here. I don't see any responses, Alan, so I guess we can go ahead. Thanks for that.
Okay, good. Okay,
Cheers.
this case study, this is case study for today, or this first case study is South Parade Domestic Wharf in Port Vila. Port Vila is the main shipping port in Vanuatu, and it's vital for serving the outlying islands. In 2016, the construction of the new wharf commenced, but it was suspended in 2017 because of design concerns, and a new design was required, including a new environmental assessment, and the Department of Environment also required that an environmental permit is also required. ADB required an updated EIA, or updated IEE, and an EMMP, and the regulator required the new permits. The application was supported by the updated IEE based on the revised design that was being undertaken. And the environmental permit conditions were based on the country safeguard system regulations. In other words, all the the Environment Act and various regulations, and also based on the updated environmental management plan that was undertaken during that update of the environmental assessment. And these were then, the EMP and the environmental permit conditions were then included in the design, in the contract documents. This is absolutely vital point, and we'll be talking about that again a bit later, that you need to include the environmental permit conditions and the environmental management plan into the contract documents. And as far as the implementing agency is concerned, the environmental permit conditions are legally binding for the implementing agency. So it's important that they are included both in the contract, and it's up to the implementing agency to make sure that the conditions of the environmental permit, as per the Environmental Act or whatever regulations it is, must comply with that. So the agency that is implementing a project must comply with the country system. So here is the geographical setting of our project. You can see Vanuatu, the islands of Vanuatu on the left-hand side. It's spread over quite a vast piece of ocean. And then to the right-hand side, we see Port Vila. This is the island of Efate, and our project is in just very close to Port Vila here, this little dot here. And here, again, this is just a blow-up of the project area. Here is South Parade Wharf just here. You can see it's about 2 kilometers from the main city or main hub of Port Vila itself. It's located in South Parade Bay here, and adjacent to this new international wharf that was completed in 2017. And South Parade is just this little slab of reclamation here, and this little L-shaped half-completed wharf. That's what we're looking at, this area. And you can see a channel that has been dredged through this reef here. This was dredged, South Parade Channel was dredged as part of the original, the initial construction of the South Parade Wharf, which was abandoned. But the channel had been dredged because then ships would come through here, have access to the wharf through that channel, rather than having to go right around this way through around Irereki Island. So the dredging was completed in 2017, and you can see the L-shaped wharf, partial construction of South Parade Wharf. So this is where our project is. This is our project. So developing the environmental management plan according to our risk assessment approach that we are using, we have 6 key steps, and we will be looking in this in our presentation today at 5 steps. So the first 5 steps, we'll be looking at preparing a monitoring plan at next week's presentation. So the 5 key steps in developing the environmental management plan are: firstly, define the project influence area, identify sensitive receptors and environmental values, and we'll discuss we'll talk about what they are soon. Thirdly, identify project components and construction activities. The 4th step, conduct a risk assessment. And then the 5th step, identify environmental management measures. And then the 6th step, which we'll be looking at next week, is prepare the monitoring plan. So step 1, define project influence area. Well, as per the environmental assessment, it covers indirect, secondary, and cumulative impacts. It includes the project site itself, the immediately adjoining area, and broader affected areas, areas that might be subject to induced or indirect impacts, or areas subject to cumulative impacts. So different projects would have different influence area, but we must include all of them. That includes any quarries, any borrow areas that are used for servicing the site, spoil disposal areas, and any transport corridors that are used for taking materials to or removing materials from the site. Indirect impacts could be, for example, an indirect impact is when it's not an impact of the actual project itself, but it has become an impact because of the project. And a good example of an indirect impact would be the effect of, say, a new road was being constructed through a forest area that forest had previously been not accessible to logging, but the new road that was the project opened up access to the forest for future logging. So that is an indirect impact on the surrounding forest due to the project impact. That's what we're talking about. That's an example of an indirect impact. And then cumulative impacts, of course, are additional impacts on existing and future planned projects. There are also transboundary impacts, impacts that go across different countries. In the Pacific Islands, it's not so, you wouldn't have too many transboundary impacts, but in countries which are landlocked or very close to other countries, you know, a big project could have an impact on a neighboring country. So this is our project area that we have defined. You can see here, this is where the project is, the reconstruction of the partially constructed wharf, a little bit of dredging of this area to connect to the channel that's already there. And, you know, it's a fairly localized project. So we've sort of arbitrarily put a boundary here that includes most of the key sensitive receptors that would likely be affected by this project. So the second step is identify environmental or sensitive receptors. What do we mean by that? Communities or objects that are at risk from impacts. They could include physical, biological, or social environments. For example, social communities, a social community receptor could be a school, health clinics, residential areas, churches, or special sites. It can also include, of course, environmental receptors like ecological communities, marine environment, coral areas, protected areas, endangered or critical species. And it also can include the work site itself, objects, buildings, or artifacts affected by vibration at the work site or erosion. So I'm sure many of you will understand what we mean by environment. Anything that can be affected by the works, any environmental component that can be affected. So for our site, the key sensitive receptors for our project, which is in this little red area here, we see like marine water quality could definitely be affected by dredging. Iroriki Reef itself, this coral reef in here, well, it already has been affected by previous dredging, and it will be affected again by dredging here. There are some nearest residences south of the site in this area here, although you can't see it on this plan, but this is up above, very high, probably maybe 50, 60 meters cliff face behind the site, and these residences are actually over the top of the cliff. They cannot see the site, but as far as a crow flies, they're probably a few hundred meters from the site. So they could be affected by potentially noise or dust. We have potentially coastal processes could be affected by dredging. Changing the nature of the seafloor could potentially affect coastal processes. That could be another potential sensitive receptor. And then we've got Irariki Resort on the island of Irariki here, that again is a potential sensitive receptor within our project boundary, or our project, what we call our project influence area. And here's an example of the Irariki Reef. Because there was going to be dredging, we undertook a marine ecological survey just to identify exactly what was there, as what sensitive habitats were there. And as a result of that, we saw that there was various types of habitat. The first one, which is not, let me see here. Yeah, the first one here, which is, it's not actually marked here, but this is artificial habitat along the piles of the pre-existing partially constructed wharf that formed a habitat. There was recruitment of corals along those piles. That was one habitat. We had soft bottom habitat here. We had patchy rock habitat. We had coral rubble, sand and silt habitat. So a variety of habitats were identified, and within those habitats, there were 21 coral species identified in 4 of the 5 habitats. They were all of these habitats, you see M in front of them all, they're all classified as modified habitats. ADB has a classification of habitats that are critical habitats, at C, natural habitats, N, or modified habitats. And clearly, these habitats have all been modified. You can just see by the fact that we've had a reclamation here as part of the neighbouring site, and the reclamation that was initially part of the first part, initial construction of South Paray, and there was dredging here. So these habitats have been modified. And so they are not natural habitats as such, but just because they're modified habitats does not mean that they don't contain significant flora and fauna. And we found that in the artificial habitat, for example, along the wharf piles, there were 8 species that had recruited themselves over the last few years while this project had been sitting idle. At the patchy rock habitat, there were 18 species, even though modified, even though this dredging had happened some years ago, there were still 18 species of fauna there. The soft bottom habitat had 8 species. And many of the colonies were young, coral colonies were young and small, indicating a very high degree of recruitment. So you could see from our ecological survey that even with the past works over a number of years, there was very high recruitment of corals and other species. But most species were common. There was only one that was categorized as vulnerable, and none were categorized as endangered or critically endangered. And there was one curryfish or sea cucumber that was observed to be vulnerable. So even in a modified habitat, you can have significant ecology. And we considered that some of this ecology was significant, even though it was modified. And as a result, it was recommended that a coral transplant, translocation was undertaken to remove some of these corals to another location, just to ensure that we're not losing existing biodiversity. And here's just some pictures of some of the corals we've got. This is a vulnerable species, colony Acropora from the soft bottom habitat. And you can see here on the artificial habitat here, encrusting coral on a wharf pile. And this just happened over a few years. So even just over a short time, we had quite a lot of recruitment on the wharf pile. And here is the curryfish or the sea cucumber, which is a vulnerable species. All these were found in the area that is likely to be dredged or significantly affected by dredging. So the next stage is step 3, construction activities. And here what we do with construction activities, you look at the project components. We identify various schedule activities for the construction phase of the project, This will have been prepared during the detailed design phase. So we'll have project components and then a detailed construction activities, and this will all come from their schedule of works. So in our particular case, the key project components are demolition of the partially constructed wharf. You can see down here, this L-shaped wharf here will be demolished. There'll be construction of a new wharf and ramp at the northern end. You can see this is superimposed here. These little squares are the proposed new platform wharf, and the ramp structure on the north here to ensure that roll-on, roll-off type of vessels can come up to here. The third component is dredging of this area here to ensure connection with the dredge channel, to ensure safe depth for vessels coming up against the wharf. And then finally, provision of wharf services on the existing reclamation here, the existing part of the formed, the land side of the wharf. So these are the 4 project components. And just showing you a bit more in detail here from the engineering drawing, we have the existing reclamation in this yellow area here. We have just shaded out here in grey you can see the piles here of the partially constructed wharf here, the proposed new platform wharf at the northeastern end here, the ramp at the northern end of the reclaimed area, and then the little finger wharf coming out here. These are all new structures, and then the brown area is the area that needs to be dredged. So these are the key components of the and key activities that need to happen during the construction. So now we break down the project components into construction activities, specific construction activities, roughly in line with their sequence. So the first construction activity is site clearance, and we'll go through that. I'll show you some examples of that. Then secondly would be demolition and removal of the existing structures that are not needed. Then thirdly, dredging. Then after the dredging, piling for the new platform. After piling, rock armoring for the revetment, and then deck and ramp construction. And finally, site pavement, drainage, water supply and lighting for the main land side part of the wharf. So this is, and then we move on to, once we've identified the activities, we then move on to conducting the risk assessment. And this 4th step, development of the risk assessment, is the step that requires the greatest application of professional judgment. Now, just a word here, this is just a methodology. You don't have to use the risk assessment approach in developing the EMP, but it's a very useful approach. It's almost foolproof because it makes you systematically look at each activity and conduct, look at likelihood and consequence. So for each construction activity, there will be a range of likelihoods and consequences for each of those construction activities we looked at before. And that will determine the degree of risk of the activity. And the degree of risk is just a multiplication, a simple multiplication of likelihood and consequence. And we just use a very simple formula here where likelihood, we divide it up into 4 different, give it 4 different values. That a particular impact is certain, we give it a value of 5. If a particular impact is likely, we give it 3. Unlikely, 2. If it's rare that will happen, 1. Similarly with consequence. If that particular impact resulted in a catastrophic consequence, we'd give it the highest value of 5. Major, 3, moderate, 2, minor, 1, etc. And then in order to complete the risk assessment matrix, we must record the assessment results in a risk assessment matrix. So that's what we do here. So we do our risk assessment, you see, and we develop this risk assessment matrix. So that on the left-hand side here, we have our specific construction activity. And for each construction activity, there will be a range of different risks. And we're going to go through some examples coming up, but so you systematically put each construction activity on the left-hand side and then identify the risks for that particular construction activity on this second column. And then you say, well, is that hazard or that impact likely? And you give it a score. And then you say, well, what are the consequences of that impact? And you give it a score, to, 5, 3, 2, 1. And then you get your risk score. So that's what you fill out as you're doing your risk assessment. So let's look at an example 1, site clearance. That's the first activity. And you can see here, we're looking at, we're looking on the left-hand side, we're looking from the seaward edge of the existing partially constructed wharf, looking to the land. And then on the other picture, we're looking from the land side back to the out to sea. So the photographs are looking opposite sides. So you can see it's a fairly bare site. There's not a lot of things that need to be cleared there. So, but we identify what are the risks for site clearance? What are the potential risks? So we can identify here 5 risks. Potential damage to vegetation beyond the project footprint, that could be risk. Traffic safety on local roads, taking materials to and from clearance, because there was some old piles that needed to be removed, and there was a pile of coral rubble that was required to be removed there. Traffic, that could have an impact on roads. Erosion of sediment carried into the bay by any site clearance activities, any dust generation, noise. So these are the potential risks associated with site clearance, and they're very common risks associated with any project construction site clearance. So let's look at what are the hazards to consider. We put this into the matrix, and you can see on the left-hand side we've got our construction activity, and then we've listed those particular risks that we have identified. So then we say, what is the likelihood? What's the likelihood of damage to vegetation beyond the footprint? Well, the likelihood is pretty low for site clearance, because there's virtually no vegetation at all. So you can give that the lowest score. For traffic safety on roads, well, the potentially, there'll be a bit of traffic going onto the road, but there is also quite a lot of traffic on that road from the port. So you might say, well, it's probably unlikely that it will have a significant impact on local roads for the site clearance. I mean, it's debatable. Again, when you're doing these risk assessments and you're assigning values, different people will have different values for these things, and that's okay. What we're trying to do is identify a relative values here. They're not cast in stone. It's not quantitative. It's more of a qualitative approach. Erosion of sediment into the bay. Well, that potentially could happen, but it's unlikely. There's not a lot of material that's going to be moved around in site clearance that would cause that to happen. Dust generation would be relatively low in this particular case. And noise, we don't think the noise associated with site clearance for this site would likely affect the sensitive receivers, which are about 60 meters up, or 50 to 60 meters up and over the brow of the hill. It's unlikely that those sensitive receivers would be affected. But again, these values are debatable. Some people might put, 1 for traffic safety. Some people might put 3 for traffic safety for this. It doesn't really matter. The point is that the fact is that you're thinking about it and you're assigning a value based on your own judgment, or the judgment of you and a few other people. And in doing these assessments, it's always good to involve other people, not just yourself, because different people have different views, and you can discuss with each other and come to an agreement as to what you think are the likelihood and what you think would be the consequence. And then moving on to consequence in the same way, assign a value. Damage to vegetation beyond the project footprint. What would be the consequence of that? Well, in this particular case, there's very little vegetation around anyway, so it would be minor or nil. Traffic safety on local roads. Well, if there was indeed, it's unlikely, but if there was indeed an accident, well, that's major. So you'd give it a 3. Erosion and sediment into the bay. Well, the amount of erosion sediment that's likely to happen from that site clearance activity, now that all the reclamation is completed, it's actually been affected in the past by that. I would say it's probably fairly minor for this particular activity. Dust generation, well, there could be a bit of dust moving around. The consequence of that, not huge. It would be, I would even say minor. You know, I've put there moderate, but it potentially could be minor. Noise, same thing. It could be moderate or minor because the noise wouldn't last for very long. There's a lot of noise around with other traffic. So the consequences of noise on the site to sensitive receivers would probably, I would say it probably isn't even moderate. I think I've overdone it there. It would probably be a 1, minor. But again, you can see, different people will have different values. They would assign different values. And then you conduct your risk score, a simple multiplication, and you get a risk score. So 1 for damage to vegetation, 6 for traffic safety on roads, 2 erosion, 2 for dust generation, and 2 for noise. Now you can see very quickly where your key risks are just by looking at the numbers. Your key risk for that particular activity is traffic safety on roads. You can just see that straight away. The others are relatively low, but traffic safety is the key risk there. And then using the risk scores, here we have, these are all the possible risk scores you could have. You've got the highest risk score would be catastrophic and certain, which would be a score of 25, and the lowest score would be 1, minor and rare. And as a rule of thumb, we say that any score that is greater than 6 or greater will require some degree of mitigation, but any score below 6 is relatively minor and would not necessarily require mitigation or just standard good construction practice. But anything sort of getting up above 6, then you need to start thinking about specific mitigation measures to reduce that impact. So then the final step is here, step 5 is assigning environmental mitigation measures. And then you look at, particularly you focus in on the risk scores that are highest. And in our case, traffic impacts, well, you'd prepare and implement a traffic management plan as part of the construction environmental management plan, include traffic safety, identification of haulage routes, and commute periods to minimize disturbances and controls, etc. And there are a lot of standard good practice environmental mitigation measures for different construction activities that are around that would be applicable to this. So it's not rocket science. It just needs to be thought about, and these issues actually, these measures need to be included as part of the risk assessment. For those you can see, for erosion and sediment, dust generation, noise, it's just standard good construction practice. A good construction environmental practice would be sufficient environmental measures for those lower risk score numbers. So that we've just gone through our first example. Before I go into the second example, have we got any queries or comments on this approach or what we've gone through?
Thanks, Alan. So we're looking at the chat box. Can you go to the latest comment? Okay, so there's one from Lillian. Mm-hmm. Would the same project cycle stages be followed for a project which has undergone initial construction but disturbed as a result of natural disaster or social unrest? I would think that after the disturbance has occurred, the risks and mitigation measures may have changed, decreased, or increased. So it's a comment and a question at the same time. What is your response there, Alan?
Can you just, I didn't quite get that. Can you just say it again?
Okay, so are you able to view the chat box?
I'll just have a look at the chat. Let's have a look.
Mapello, it's Greg here.
Yeah.
Hi, Greg.
I can jump in if Alan's having an issue.
Yeah, no, you go ahead, Greg, please.
Sure.
Hi, Greg,
thanks,
bye.
Alan. Yep, thanks. There's also another question I saw earlier from Basil, so we'll get to that as well. So, Lian, yeah, this is a great question because often projects pause, and as Alan explained with this case study, in fact, there was a couple of years hiatus between they commencing the works and then they're going to now do the expansion. So yes, if there is significant change that you observe to the site, due to civil unrest or natural disaster, then it is prudent to do another risk assessment. In
Yes.
fact, as we go through this EMP training, Alan will explain that the EMP is actually very much a living document. You don't set it in stone and then get to site and assume that everything stays exactly as you planned in the office, because when you get out there, construction guys often uncover things that you weren't quite sure about when you wrote the plan. So you may have to modify it. So yes, if there's been a significant change, weather change, even if you change the construction timing. So if you normally were planning on building this in the dry season, but for some reason it got delayed and you had to do it in the wet, then your risk assessment has to be revisited, and that includes your mitigation measures and your assignment of risks. Likewise, there was a question I actually had for Alan, and to pose to this actual project. If you discover contamination on the site, that will throw into the mix a whole heap of other issues you have to consider with your risk. So if you previously thought that the sediment might be safe to dispose, but now you realize it's contaminated with asbestos or other contaminants of high risk to humans, then you would have to adjust your mitigation strategies and your risk ratings for everything. So
yes, that's absolutely correct. And but in this particular case, the reclamation was basically made up from the dredging, the previous dredging that was undertaken. It was put onto the surface and used as reclamation, so it wasn't actually contaminated. And but you're absolutely right. If you're using whatever material you're using, it need to be assured that it wasn't from contaminated source. And if that actually happened, or if indeed the material that you're removing is contaminated, again, you have to go through that whole process of dealing with the risks of removing and disposal of contaminated land. But in our particular case, that didn't apply.
Thanks, Alan. So I guess we'll just ask Lily if that answered her questions. And then I don't know if you saw the question from Bazin earlier. They posted it just after we started this session. It was about the key or the basic structures of an EIA and EMP. So we'll just ask Lillian if her question's been answered, and then maybe we can go to the others. Yep, Lillian's fine. Okay,
and I see another question there. Can you connect the relationship between EMP and CMP? We're coming to that, so just hold on. And a TOR, is the EMP constructing of a project TOR? Basically, we'll talk about that as we go through. As the EMP develops, it then, when it gets to the construction stage, the EMP then is used for the contractor then uses the EMP to develop his construction environmental management plan. So they're all part of the same continuum. We just, as the project moves from preparation through to implementation, and as situations change, it just gets refined and more detailed each step of the way, so that we're not missing anything and we're covering all potential impacts and new impacts as they come across, and it's constantly being reviewed. So it's part of a continuum, starting with the initial EMP in the project preparation phase, to updated EMP during the detailed design, and then when the contractor starts constructing, he then takes the updated EMP, looks at his construction methodology, and then develops his construction environmental management plan to meet all the requirements of the EMP based on his methodology. But we'll be looking at that a little bit later on. Okay, so we'll move on. Okay, so just a second example, dredging. So let's examine dredging. This is the activity with the most impact. We went from the activity with the least impact for this particular project, site clearance. Actually, incidentally, site clearance is often for greenfield projects, often that's where the biggest impacts occur, because the contractor will rush into the site and clear everything and want to get started work. Want it to start work. So site clearance often is the biggest impact. Certainly initially the biggest construction impact. But so just keep that in mind. But for our case, because it is actually already a construction site, it's the least impact for this particular project. So dredging is the one with the most impact on this project. So these photos show the, on the left-hand side, top left-hand side, this is during the dredging of the South Parade Channel during the earlier part of the project. And here's on this side, this is when it's completed. You can see the reef there. It is bifurcated by the channel. And then at the bottom photo here, you can see the existing channel, our new structure superimposed over the part of the channel that needs to be dredged to connect, or part of this reef that needs to be dredged to connect with the channel for the new project. So what are the hazards associated with dredging? Well, these are the hazards we've identified: loss or damage to marine life and habitat, increased turbidity in the marine environment, potential impact on coastal processes, disposal of dredged material, pollution from oils and fuels, worker and community safety, both on the land and on the dredger itself, and noise. And there could be more, but these are probably the most important hazards of dredging. Again, we have our risk matrix there, and on the second column in, we identify all our risks beside dredging. And then we undertake we assess the likelihood of that. Loss or damage to marine life. Well, it cannot be avoided, it's going to happen. So we give it a 5. It's certain through dredging that we're going to lose or damage some marine life and habitat. Increased turbidity in marine environment, absolutely going to happen. The scale of it, well, you know, that's debatable, but it's going to happen. You can't have dredging without some turbidity. Impact on coastal processes. Well, I've given it a 1 here, and the reason I've given it a 1 is because in the previous environmental assessment for the South Parade Dredge Channel, there was hydrodynamic modelling done for that channel. And the hydrodynamic modelling showed that the impact of that new channel, that new dredge channel, would not have any significant impact on coastal processes. So that's why it's given a 1. And that's the only reason, because that work was previously done. And we know that this little extra bit of dredging is most unlikely to change that assessment or change that outcome. Disposal of dredge material, well, we're going to have to dispose of it somehow. The likelihood of the impacts, there will be an impact, so we give it the highest score. Pollution from oils and fuels, well, I've given it a 2. It's probably unlikely, simply because dredgers, you know, they will probably have quite, you know, they'll have been used to having controls to limit that. It could happen, but it's unlikely. You might want to give it a 3. You could say likely. I tend to think unlikely. If you get a good operator in, it's unlikely that there will be significant pollution from oils and fuels from dredging. But I'm open. If you want to change it to 3, that's fine. Worker and community safety, same reasons. They'll have good health and safety plans for dredging. It's unlikely that there'll be a problem, but it's possible. Noise, most unlikely, given the distance from nearest sensitive receptors. Dredging is a noisy, a noisy operation, can be very noisy, depending on the dredging method. But in our case, we consider that the noise sensitive receptors are not in a line of sight. They're over the top of the brow of a hill. They will unlikely be affected by that. But again, as I say, you know, some of these values, just because I've put those numbers down doesn't mean I'm right. I mean, we all have different ways of looking at this, and it's always good when you're doing this risk assessment to involve other specialists, and that includes engineers, project managers, people, or environmental people, social people. It's just helpful to involve other people with other ideas so that you can come to some kind of agreement on these values. Now let's look at consequence. Well, the loss of damage to marine life and habitat. I put a 2 here. I think it's moderate because it's already a highly disturbed environment there. It's been disturbed by dredging and reclamation before. So the consequence of loss of that habitat, not huge, I'd say it's moderate in this particular case, given the scale. Increase in turbidity in the marine environment, again, the consequence, I would say 2. You might have a different view. Impact on coastal processes, we've already discussed that. It's the consequence, 1, because we know from the modelling that it's unlikely to have an impact. The disposal of dredged material, well, moderate. Again, this is based on the fact that we know that the dredged material in Vanuatu or Port Vila is not allowed to be dumped at sea. It has to be taken onto land, and it's a requirement that it is disposed at an approved disposal site. So therefore, we can give the consequence of that is likely to be moderate, given the approval processes that it has to go through for disposal. Pollution from oils and fuels. Well, we said the likelihood was low, but the consequence of that could be quite high. It would be major if you had a significant oil spill or fuel spill from the dredger. It would be major. I would consider it major. Worker and community safety. Again, if someone was hurt or someone was killed on the site, that's catastrophic to a family. So, and again, noise. We've just given it a consequence of 1. So very quickly, you get your risk score, and you can see very quickly where the key impacts, the key risks are. They're in loss and damage to marine life, increased turbidity, disposal of dredged material, and worker and community safety. And then we go, and then we get these various mitigation measures. So for loss of damage to marine life, we prepared and implemented a marine fauna relocation plan prior to commencement of the works, as recommended in the Marine Ecological Assessment, and this was done by the implementing agency, by the government. We did not. You can put some of these requirements in for the contractor, but in the case of ecology, it's not their core business. You know, doing ecological assessments, doing anything to do with ecology, it's not the contractor's core business. It's better to get in my view anyway, it's better for, if you're having to do any significant ecological mitigation, it's better to get that in the hands of specialist people that you as the client or the project manager or the implementing agency have more control over, and let the contractor focus on his construction work. So that's what we did here at Port Vila. We have undertaken that marine fauna relocation plan in accordance with the recommendations of the Marine Ecological Assessment. Increased turbidity, well, here we go. Minimize the dredging footprint, avoid dredging during coral spawning periods, use dredging methods that minimize release of suspended solids, deploy silt curtains around dewatering bund. And so these are standard sorts of measures that would be used to reduce the impact of turbidity on the marine environment from dredging. And again, coastal processes, we've discussed that. Disposal of dredged material, as I said, disposal to the marine environment was prohibited, but it has to be taken to a government approved location. So that's all fairly well regulated. Pollution from oils, ensure the plant maintained and no leakage of fuels. These are standard good construction, good environmental construction procedures. And there are many contractors know about these things, but you still need to specify them in your environmental management plan. And then implementation for health and safety, implementation of an approved worker health and safety plan. And then noise, of course, standard good construction practice means all construction plants to be well maintained and meet international noise standards. So in summary, developing the EMP. It's a key component of environmental assessment and it must be updated throughout the project cycle. It's a living document. It continues, it needs to be continued to be reviewed as situations change through the project preparation and implementation stages through the project cycle. It's best developed using a systematic risk assessment methodology, which we've just shown you. You don't have to use that risk assessment methodology. Those of us who've been in the business, who've been doing this for a long time, you know the risks very quickly. You know most risks you know from your own experience. But for those who are not that experienced in that area, or even still for experienced people, just going through that risk assessment process, it's foolproof. Well, I wouldn't say totally foolproof, but it's pretty foolproof in terms of if you put each of the activities down and then systematically look at the likelihood and consequences, you're not going to miss anything drastic. You're going to really identify the key risks. So it's useful in that respect. The EMP specifies the mitigation requirements to ensure that the project results in no unacceptable environmental impacts, forms the basis for the regulators' approval and consent conditions. And then finally, it must be included in the bid and contract documents. And we're going to talk about that a little bit next, but this is critically important. We've got a wonderful EMP document, but it has to be able to be implemented. And the first step of that is making sure it's in the bid and contract documents. So before we move on to looking at part 2, how to ensure that the EMP is implemented, are there any queries and comments so far?
I don't think so, Alan. Looking at the chat box. Anybody has any questions, please use the chat box or the hand prompt. I think your presentation is extremely excellent, Alan, and it's a testament. I think everybody understands very clearly what you're saying.
Good. That's good. It's good for me.
Yes.
Okay, let's move on. Now, as I said, we've got this wonderful EMP document, beautiful document, singing, dancing, got everything in it. And then, we can have these documents and we go to site and it looks like a mess. So the important thing is to translate the document to being implemented. And the EMP has no value, no matter how beautiful it looks, unless it is implemented. So the objective of this module is to explain the actions that are needed to ensure that the EMP is properly implemented by the contractor. So we'll look at how the requirements of the approved EMP must be effectively integrated into bid and contract documentation, and the importance of the contractor's environmental management plan, the importance of the CEMP, and how it needs to be developed from the EMP. But before we continue, let's just recap where we're at in the project cycle at this point. So we're at stage 3 here, detailed design, engineering, and procurement. So the EIA and EMP has been updated based on the detailed design. We've obtained environmental license and consent under the country safeguard system, based on the approved environmental management plan. The environmental management plan and consent conditions have been included in the bid and contract documents. And the end of that, the milestone for the end of stage 3 is construction contracts are awarded. Procurement occurs. So this is critical here. The environmental management plan must be integrated into tenders and contracts. If it's not properly integrated into tenders and contracts, into tender documents, the contractor can claim that they don't have to comply with it because it's not part of his work requirements. You see, if you don't put these requirements in the contract, he has no obligation. The contractor, he signs the contract. If it's not in there, that he has to do these things, he won't do it. So it's critical that the environmental management plan is addressed as a condition of contract. It ensures that the environmental management plan is also properly costed and resourced so that if it's in the bidding document, the contractor can see what he needs to do and make sure that he's got the resources and the money to be able to do that. It needs to be supported, the EMP in the contract needs to be supported by systems to enable its compliance. And it ensures that institutional arrangements for the environmental management are in place. So integrating the EMP with the tender documents is absolutely essential. I can't stress that enough. We can't miss this step, because after the contract has been awarded and signed, it's too late to try and enforce the EMP's provisions. You just can't. Contractor, he won't listen to you. He only listens, he will only listen to what's in the contract. So there are two key components when drafting the environmental management requirements. That is, firstly, detailed environmental management requirements, including site-specific planning. In other words, you need to specify that in the contract, that the contractor needs to prepare a construction environmental management plan or a construction and environmental social management plan. It's got to be specified in there. If you don't specify it, he will say, I don't have to do a construction environmental management plan. You've got your environmental management plan in there. I'll just do whatever I need to do to meet that. But we're saying you need to tell him in the contract that he needs to prepare a specific construction environmental management plan based on the environmental management plan that shows how his methodology, how he's going to undertake the construction and meet the requirements of the EMP in using his methodology. See, it needs to be very specific to how he goes about it. And the second thing is we need to have inspection and control of the contract in the contract documents. He needs to be advised, the contractor needs to be advised that regular inspections are going to be undertaken and that he is going to be called to account to ensure that he implements it. So just a note here, a level of professional judgment should be used when the environmental management plan requirements are being drafted to ensure that they are relevant to the nature and scale of the project and that they are fit for purpose. You know, sometimes you can put in a whole lot of irrelevant stuff for a small project, relevant environmental management plan requirements that are maybe irrelevant to a small project. It needs to, when preparing these bid documents, care needs to be taken to make sure that the environmental management plan is fit for purpose for a particular contract. And the same goes if sometimes it's a very complex project that requires quite detailed environmental management requirements in the document. And if you don't put those details in, then it's not enough for him to do it. So looking at the key component one, detailed EMP requirements, including site-specific planning. And here's a clause, a potential clause in a contract. The contractor shall prepare and submit their construction environmental management plan to meet the requirements of the environmental management plan for the approval of the employer and follow all directions of the employer. This shall include site-specific environmental management plans. We'll get to that in a moment. The construction environmental management plan will be submitted to the employer for approval before commencing any work on site, and no construction activities will be allowed until the CEMP is approved by the project management unit. Now, you've got to have that in the contract. If you don't have that in the contract, if you don't specify those things in the contractor won't do it. So, you know, you have these situations where contractors just go on site and before they've done their construction environmental management plan, if it's not in there, if it's not in the contract, that he needs to have approval of it before he goes onto the, he can just do it. So very important to have these clauses in the contract. That's where your control comes from. That's where your enforcement will come from. And key component two, inspection and control of the contractor. You need to give notice that he is going to be, that he's going to be inspected. And here is an example clause. The employer will regularly inspect works undertaken by the contractor to check on the implementation of environmental management and monitoring requirements. A non-compliance notice will be issued to the contractor. If the employer requires action to be taken, the contractor is required to prepare a corrective action plan. See, very specific, which is to be implemented by a date agreed with the employer. The failure to prepare a corrective action plan or to implement it within the agreed timeframe will result in the owner undertaking the works and passing the costs on plus 15%. So it's got an enforcement clause in there. And this is just an example. You don't have to have that one, but there is all sorts of different enforcement clauses that you can put in, but you need to specify him. He needs to be contractually bound to do this. And he needs to be aware that this is written in the contract, so that when there is a non-compliance, you can go back to the contract and say, look, it's written. You're supposed to prepare a corrective action plan. If you don't do it, when, we're going to get someone else to fix up your mess and pass the cost on. So you've got to have these things in the actual contract. Okay, construction environmental management plan. So where are we in the project cycle? Construction contracts have been awarded. We're at stage 4, pre-construction. Construction contracts have been awarded. The contractor, and he's required in his bid document, in his contract, to prepare a construction environmental management plan. It's got to be based on the updated EMP and to be updated as required. The CMP clearly sets out the need for subsequent application for any additional permits he might need down the track in his in the construction schedule, and submission of other plans such as covering materials sourcing and that sort of thing. We'll look at that in a moment. And the CEMP needs to be reviewed and cleared by the PMU and the development partner prior to works commencing. And only after that has been approved, then construction can commence. So this is a critical phase, the pre-construction phase, because the contractor just usually, when they've got the contract, they think they can just go onto site and get started. Well, we're saying no, there's a hold point here. We want to have the CEMP, the Construction Environmental Management Plan, approved before that happens. So this is a very useful diagram that shows the relationship between the environmental management plan and the construction environmental management plan. So you see at the top there, we have the updated environmental management plan that was prepared during the detailed design that has gone into the bid document and the contract document. And then what we're asking the contractor to do is then to prepare his own construction environmental management plan to meet the requirements of the EMP. Now that construction environmental management plan will have a number of components to it. These sub-plans are really important. It will have topic-specific environmental management plans. For example, every construction environmental management plan needs to have a traffic management plan. There needs to be a waste management plan. There needs to be a noise management plan. There needs to be a social impact management plan or construction camp management plan. So we need to have all of these little sub-plans as part of the overall construction plan, because this is the contractor has to demonstrate through these little plans how he's going to meet the mitigation requirements that are set out in the EMP that's above. And they should be based on, as you see in the middle there, the construction method statements and various risk assessments using the similar approach that we've used to form the EMP. That risk assessment approach is a very good, useful approach for contractors to use in preparing their topic specific. And then we look at the site-specific environmental management plans. These site-specific environmental management plans ask for specific activities, such as, for example, dredging. You might have a site-specific environmental management plan as part of the overall construction environmental management plan that deals just with dredging. Another one, might deal with land clearance in a particular area. So we want the CEMP. You can see the detail that we're trying to get the contractor to do. We're trying to get him to demonstrate through his construction method statement how he's going to meet the requirements of the EMP. So that's how specific we want him to be. That's what we're looking for in a construction environmental management plan. So what should a good CEMP contain? And here's just an example of what should be what a good CMP should contain. Firstly, section 1, introduction and purpose of the CMP. Identify the project, state the purpose and the overall coverage, name and contact details of the person who prepared it, contractor's person responsible for implementing the CEMP, Contractor's environmental policy or vision statement, we want to see that. In the introduction, we want to see how he describes how the CEMP links with the construction program and all the various site-specific plans or topic-specific plans. This is in the introduction. How and the purpose of the CEMP, how it all holds together, what the structure of the CEMP is. Section 2, roles and responsibility, very important. What is his organizational structure? Roles and responsibility of designated people on the contractor's team. Who's responsible for supervising the CEMP? We need name, contact details, after hours emergency numbers. We need those so that if anything goes wrong, we know who to contact. We need to see reporting and communication channels. Who reports to who? What's the line of command in the contractors? You know, who's dealing with the implementation of the CEMP and how are decisions made? We need to know, we need to see that in a diagram. A contractor needs to identify roles of others, what role of supervision consultant is relative to the role of his own team. What the role of how does the National Environmental Regulating Agency fit in with monitoring what he's doing? The ADB and Financing Institution. We want to see all that on a plan, how it fits in. What are the roles and responsibilities? What are the lines of channels of communication, reporting lines? And then thirdly, we want to see the legal requirements, brief outline of environmental and land related laws and regulations, standards, licenses, permits that the contractor must comply with. And then section 4, a general overview of environmental and social or cultural impacts. And these are just, identify special issues associated with the location of works. There might be a marine reserve nearby, significant sensitive receptors, hospitals, schools or something. We just need to see that he's got that and he's identified that in his scope of works. He needs to advise any approvals that are required and how work will be undertaken in those specific areas, those sensitive areas, and locate the boundaries to the areas in his plan of works. We want to see all this. Section 5, a scope and description of the works, describing his construction methodology, including construction method statements for the site-specific plans. And this will be linked to the construction program for all the works. So you see he'll have an overall construction program that he is following, and this should be included as part of the CEMP. He should show a plan of the works, and at least an A3 plan showing a location of all construction sites and support facilities based on detailed engineering plans. Plant and equipment to be brought to site, details of sites used to source raw materials, quarry sites, disposal sites, that sort of thing, and details of the contractor's facilities. That includes his camp management, his camps and his works areas. And then we need specific identification of the risks and impacts associated with his specific approach and methodology of works, including specific measures to mitigate impacts to meet EMP targets. And 7, so that identification of risk can be almost a bullet point of risks and impacts. That's all he needs to do as long as he's identified them all. And then section 7 would be all the mitigation measures to mitigate those particular risks and impacts. And that means developing measures identified in the EMP as relevant to the specific works and activities to be undertaken, but it needs to be in accordance with his works method statements, his construction method statements, site specific. So these will include the sub-plans that we talked about before: health and safety plan, noise plan, water quality, waste management plans, traffic control plans, site-specific plans for specific components and activities or specific sites, and then procedures for complying with the project's grievance redress mechanism and community consultation plan. That's really important. The contractor's stakeholder consultation, because that continues all the way through the project. And he will be required to ensure that he follows the community consultation plan that is prepared as part of the environmental assessment. And if you refer back to that handout, you'll see I've got details in there of how the community consultation plan is developed through the different stages in the project cycle. And then finally, monitoring and reporting. The section needs to set out the timing and frequency and responsibilities for monitoring compliance with the approved CEMP, and it will identify various reporting requirements. And annexes, he can put in his risk assessments like we've just been through before, and any checklists he uses to check that he's implementing his approved CEMP. So this just gives you some idea of the detail that we're looking at for a construction environmental management plan. And it's quite a bit more detailed than the EMP, as you can see. EMP is based on what we understand to be the project in terms of the detailed design, but the CEMP is the EMP implemented specifically by the contractor in accordance with his methodologies. And we want to see the details. We want to see how he's doing it so that we can monitor him against that. So, important note, as we've just demonstrated, the CEMP is not just reproduction of the EMP. And often I've seen CMPs, which is just basically the EMP with a contractor's name on top. It must be site-specific, reflecting the contractor's construction methodology and schedule, and demonstrating how these activities meet the requirements of the EMP. It must be reviewed and approved by the PMU before construction, as the project management unit, before construction commences. And just a note here, even the most experienced contractors rarely get it right first time. And it's often an iterative process. You need to go backwards and forwards, and he'll get frustrated. But if you've got it specified very clearly in the contract document that this is what he needs to do, he should have prepared the resources to be able to go through that process. If it's not in the bidding document, if it's not in the contract document that he has to do this, then he's not going to provide the resources, and he'll get very frustrated at being asked to do that, and he'll ask for more money. So you need to have this, you need to have these requirements, you need to put it in the contract document that he needs to have the resources available to prepare a CEMP that will meet the approval of the implementing agency. And he must develop it well ahead of when work starts. So review and update of the EMP. And again, we're still going. It's a moving document, a living document. The CMP and the subplans, they need to be routinely reviewed and updated and supplemented as necessary throughout the construction stage. So even the CMP itself isn't the final document. Situations change. You might have a cyclone come through. There might be a change of design. All sorts of different things can happen. So key triggers for a review of the CMP would be, yes, commencement of a new phase of a project. New risks might be identified. Change in design methodology, schedule, change in location. This happens. This is what happens in construction. Things change. Could be a response to community engagement. It could be a complaint, a noise complaint, a dust complaint. Might result in the need to change his strategy in terms of mitigation. Unforeseen environmental issues, like, for example, you know, a cyclone or a major failure or something. And then finally, a key trigger would be that existing mitigation measures are not effective. So it needs to be reviewed and updated. So the project management unit, their role is to ensure that the CEMP and the subplans are up to date. All updates need to be reviewed and cleared by the project management unit. So, any queries and comments so far? What we're going to do next, so we're just going to run through some examples of an example of a construction environmental management plan on another project in Vanuatu. just to give you an idea of what these plans should look like.
Hey, Alan, can I just jump in here while just before?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
From Moon. I hope you're able to see it on your chat box. So how do we link environmental performance and economic returns for organizations to present a win-win situation to convince stakeholders to realize the importance of EMPs? The first thing that comes to my mind is the costings.
Yes.
Because a lot of the developers, they measure by the budget, by the number of the money that they have to spend. And obviously, we're trying to promote here best practices so that developers do not have to incur unforeseen costs due to not having properly developed their EMPs. So I think in simple terms, it costs a lot to not have an EMP. So that's my response, but what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you know, like in countries like New Zealand and Australia, you know, the reason construction is so expensive is because we have such tight regulations, environmental regulations. The developing countries, you see, where, you know, they don't have the same resources, money, and so, you know, they want the infrastructure, and I can really understand that. And so you don't want to burden the contractor with too many regulations, too many environmental or social regulations that where the money is not going into the infrastructure itself, it's going into these things. And you can understand, and this is a problem in a lot of developing countries where, you know, they want the infrastructure, but they just don't have the same money available to, you know, to put all of these, have really good environmental mitigation. So you know, you've identified an important issue, and it's education, and and that's what we're trying to do here, and what we're doing right at the moment, and what the funding organisations are trying to do with your regulating agencies in your country to demonstrate how, you know, it's good environmental practice is good sustainable practice generally for the country. You know, and it does cost money. It really does cost money. So, you know, I can't have any more comments than that, but it's a trade-off. And, you know, any other comments from Greg or from?
Yeah, just thanks, Alan. Yeah, from coming from the other side of the pond in Australia, yeah, I agree. Yeah, we have the benefit of a lot more money to throw at projects, but we still have the same issues. In my experience when I was working here, we have the same issues with contractors and proponents pushing back on these EMPs. But the argument, and it's similar to what Mapella said, the argument I've always had with regards to EMPs and the whole EIA process is that if you spend this money up front, you save yourself money in the long run. If you don't foresee or plan for these risks and hazards, and you have an environmental incident, it's going to cost you a lot more money to clean it up, or to stop works, or to stand down. So, you know, $1 million a day on some projects for a dredging operation to just sit idle. That's a lot of money that racks up over time if you've had a dredge plume threshold that's gone over, or you've got to clean up a beach or something. So same thing in the smaller countries and smaller developments. If you don't plan for these risks and you don't have proper mitigation in place, well, that's the risk. The risk is it's going to cost you a lot more money. So that's the way I've always tried to sell it to the proponent and the contractor.
Great, thank you.
But excellent presentation. Really been enjoying it, Alan. It's good.
Okay, we just got a few more slides before we finish. We're almost at the end there. Sorry, was there another comment there?
Yeah, it's from Patrick. Hi.
Hi.
So the slide presentation done so far is very clear and detailed. However, I'm trying to bring terms of reference and EMP together with the overall mind on EIA. Does EMP and CEMP form part of it or a component of a terms of reference? Please correct me.
Well, the way it works like this is that you have a terms of reference initially during the preparation phase for terms of reference for an environmental impact assessment. And then the construction and the terms of reference for the CEMP, it basically doesn't happen until in the bidding document, when you've got your updated environmental impact assessment and updated environmental management plan based on the detailed design, and then the bidding document is prepared using the detailed design. You then have what your requirement then is for the contractor. You tell them, just as I mentioned previously, that in the bidding document, he is required to prepare a CEMP. Now, what I like to do, I like to include what I just showed you before, a table of contents. I like to include that in the bidding document, a table of contents of a CEMP, to give the contractor some advance warning as to what our expectations are in terms of producing the CEMP. So you can include guidelines for preparing a construction environmental management plan as an annex to the bidding document. So you tell him that he's got to prepare a CEMP in the bidding document, and then you give him guidelines as to what your expectations are, so that it's clear to him what you're expecting to see. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. For the EIA regulators that are joining in, so let me try to contextualize that for you. When you develop the terms of reference for a consultant to develop the EIA report, that when you receive the EIA report with the EMP, you review the report against the terms of reference, and then after that, you will determine after you've added your comments and all the other stuff and your conditions have been shaped up. Then you would invite the private developer to submit, if it is a construction proposal, to submit a CEMP. And until you receive the CEMP and you've undergone a full assessment, then you will grant the full license. But in many cases, I see they just go ahead and grant the license.
Oh, okay.
There's a distinction that needs to be made here.
Yeah, okay, no, good point. And that's something that the regulator will have, it's something that they need to do.
Yeah, some folks, I've seen examples where they submit the ESIA or EIA and the EMP and the CMP. But the problem with that is that, that's for efficiency, but you must allow the EIA regulator the opportunity to review the EIA reports and the EMP, and through their inputs, then you should develop the CEMP.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
Yeah. One sort of predates the other or precedes the other.
Sure.
All right. Any other question?
Hi, Apollo. Just Greg, not a question. I did notice that Jean had put her hand up, but then I think she disappeared. So I don't know if she was going to add something
Hi,
or
Jean,
tell
are you
us.
there?
Yeah, so Alan covered it. I was just going to say, really, to me, the TOR for the CEMP is the project EMP that's in the environmental assessment. It's in any conditions that are attached to the development consent, the environmental license, the development permit, whatever is issued under the country system, and what's in the contract. So to me, those three documents together are the terms of reference or the guiding requirements for the contractor to prepare their CEMP. Thanks.
Thanks, Jean. Yeah, that's pretty much, yeah, that's the way that I would do it too, is that, yeah, so the EIA, the EMP and the approval conditions, that's what they have to refer to. And as Alan said, they can write a guiding document about what needs to go in to their bid document for when they're bidding to write up the CMP and what needs to be in that CMP.
Right, thanks,
there was that section that Alan referred to about legislation. So I would have just added that bit in there, that's also should include the approval conditions that were set for the project.
Yeah. Thanks, Greg. Sorry to jump in there. We've got another comment from Moon Chan. There's been an increase of environmental management plans being disclosed. However, some do not show obvious substantive improvements in environmental impacts, which has fed some skepticism about what they say and what they do. How can we ensure that continuous monitoring will occur after permits are approved? Well, anybody wants to have a first shot at that one? Listen, monitoring, I would say it's a shared responsibility between say, for example, whoever's monitoring you, or either the employer or the EIA regulator, and the contractor who is implementing the CEMP. So one sort of has to monitor the other throughout the whole project life cycle. But like I said, you're monitoring for compliance, and then you're reporting against what you find out in the field. And the key thing is that you're reviewing and you're updating your management plans, and that you are making and that you're tracking the risks along the project cycle, so that it starts from the starting point where you determine the risk level. It should be reducing as the project cycle goes, and that's how. And that's otherwise the risk will materialize depending on its scale, the scale of the project. So monitoring is done both by the contractor, because they have to demonstrate that they have a monitoring program on site to follow the CEMP that they've developed. And the EIA regulator or the PMU who's receiving the review reports have to do their own independent review to ensure that reporting from the contractor is actually accurate and real.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to look at monitoring and reporting, just exactly what you're talking about, in the next session next week. Okay. So it's very important, and we don't do justice to it by glossing it over right now. So we're just focusing on the CEMP at the moment, but next week we'll be definitely looking at roles and responsibility of those for supervising the contractor and supervising implementation of EMP. So thank you for that comment, but we will be covering it.
Thank you, Alan. Naka.
Okay, so just getting back to, we're just on the final few slides here. Stage 5, we're at construction, where the CEMP has been approved after many iterations, as is usual, and we've finally approved, and the contractor can go to site. Now, just a comment there. Sometimes we can approve the overall CEMP for example, if the contractor, he may not have all his site-specific plans prepared right at the very beginning, because if the project is a 1 or 2 year project, he may not have even thought about in detail anyway, thought about his methodology down the track, for a project down the track. So what we do need, though, is that we need whatever activity, whatever section he is going to be working on, with that particular section, that site-specific plan for that particular section or that particular activity is approved. So you can get an overall construction environmental management plan with all of the upfront stuff, all of the overall stuff, and also approval for the specific immediate activities that he's about to go into. That can be approved, and then you can say, well, you can go ahead and do your site clearance and your initial activities, but before you start your next construction activity, you've got to give us that site-specific plan for approval before that started. So we don't want to stop we're not trying to stop him do his work. We don't want to limit him from getting on with the job, and by getting everything up front done. But we can give him, what we do want is that we need to have, for whatever work he's starting with, that specific piece of work needs to be approved from a construction environmental management plan. Do you understand what I'm saying? So you can have you can give, what do you call it, provisional approval of a CEMP for site clearance, for dredging. And then with the condition that before he starts the next activity, which may be, removal of piles or something else, we need to have that site-specific plan approved before that activity begins. So just keep that in mind in terms of approval of the CEMP. So,
yep. Alan, if I may, that is an excellent point you just raised. Because I came across a few developments in Fiji that went through the same model of phased approval. So, yes. And again, it's linked to the monitoring part that you will be talking about next week. So it's important to include a monitoring committee as part of the regulators' conditions. Yes. So thank you for it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. So yeah, let's move on here. Monitoring and reporting required to construction completion. This is during construction, and we'll be talking about that next week. The project management unit and development partner undertake regular inspections and audits. And again, we'll be talking about that. And then at the end of the construction, we get the project completion report. So we're pretty much near operation. So just some example here. This is just an example of some examples of a construction environmental management plan. This is for Beaufield Airport, which was a World Bank funded project. And basically they were resurfacing with a few other, putting lighting and a few other things at the airport, but basically resurfacing the runway of Port Vila International Airport, Beaufield Airport. And this is a project involved 3 main works areas that were spread out over several kilometres. You can see we had the airport itself where the construction activity was happening, a laydown area at the airport itself, a few kilometres away, the workers' camp, and a couple of kilometres further was where the asphalt plant was located, including a loading ramp for bringing in aggregate from Australia. Actually, they didn't have good aggregate to make asphalt in Vanuatu, so that had to be brought in. So for each area, a site-specific plan would be required. You'd need one for the asphalt plant, one for the workers' camp, one for the laydown area, and one for the actual doing the construction work. And altogether, this constitutes the CEMP, but you've got these site-specific ones for these different activities. Here is the site of the asphalt plant. This is just before, this is when it was initially being prepared. Interestingly, I'll just go back here. Interestingly, previously, this is a good example of what happens in construction, is that during the design period, they thought the asphalt plant would be in this area at the end of the airport runway. It would be close to the airport, but the Department of Water said, no, you can't do that because this whole area is a water reserve, basically a water reserve for potable water. So they said, no, we don't allow you to have your asphalt plant here because of the risk of contamination. So the contractor had to go and find another place. And so he located this area here, and he rented this area, and then he had to go through, he had to get various approvals, including updating a fairly detailed construction environmental management plan, because there were a number of significant sensitive receptors here. We've got a development here, a residential development here. We've got a beach here where he was going to be offloading his aggregate and putting a temporary wharf or platform, offloading platform. We have a stream running around the edge of the site here and going out to sea with a riparian area that was potentially going to be damaged. So he had to address all of these issues in preparing his site-specific plan for the asphalt plant. And here, this is just an example of this is what we want to see in the CEMP. We don't just want to see words, we want to see a plan. So here, for example, this is his asphalt plan, his site-specific plan for the asphalt plant. And this blue line, the yellow line here is a drainage channel on the edge. The blue is the river on the edge of the site. And this is a drainage ditch that was constructed around here. He's located where his bitumen stockpile is, a bunding wall around that to prevent any overflow of that off that area. This is the actual milling area for the asphalt, and we've got the tank farm area where his fuel, etc. The workshop area here, parking lot, and then this is where he put his aggregate storage. So this is the level of detail we want to see in a site-specific environmental management plan. So we're very clear. He's demonstrating that he's actually thought about these issues. He's thought about the various sensitive receivers. He's thought about his drainage, and he's he's developed his site plan, and then we monitor this approved plan on a regular basis. This is just showing some photographs. Here is the temporary aggregate offloading plant ramp that he prepared, and there it is in operation here. You can see this is a truck here, this little red truck. So this was taken from a drone, this photograph. So it's quite a large barge with aggregate here being offloaded at the offloading ramp, just a temporary facility. And part of the CEMP was that as soon as all the aggregate, the imported aggregate was offloaded, they had to restore the beach to original position. So get rid of this offloading ramp. And here we see, this is after all of the aggregate has been put on site. It's all stored there, and the offloading ramp has been dismantled, and it's pretty much almost back to where it was. But you can see this is the operation. This is during the operation of the asphalt plant. You can see the main asphalt plant here, where the bitumen's stored over this way, the various workshops in this area here, waste and various other things. You can see the drainage channel around the edge here, and this white drainage channel here around the edge. So this just gives you an example of what we're talking about here. And here's another one that we wanted a site-specific plan of his works area at the airport itself. And one of the quarries was quite close to the airport. So a number of quarries were used, and this is quarries for coral aggregate. There was local coral aggregate which was used as the base and sub-base, but the surface material aggregate had to be imported, but there was a lot of base coral aggregate that was sourced locally. That's the laydown area. So here we are. Here we see the plan of the laydown area. We see storage area for materials, concrete drainage here, sediment traps, this sort of thing. So this is the level of detail that we want to see at his various sites. And this all comes from his construction method statements. See, any construction method statement that has to be approved by the engineer would have to have this kind of plan with it. And we want to see environmental mitigation measures as part of that. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a site-specific environmental management plan. And he would have done a risk assessment and addressed the potential, the sensitive receivers nearby, and what he needed to do to construct this this site-specific environmental management plan. And here he had to do a traffic management plan, because there were a number of quarries where he was sourcing coral aggregate. One was by the airport itself. Quarry 2 was quite a long way away from Port Vila itself, with trucks having to drive through Port Vila. Quarry 1 was a little bit closer to town, but again, the traffic had to go through town. And then, of course, there was materials and construction vehicles and various other materials that had to be brought in from the main wharf, and then transported through town to the site or to the laydown area. And then, of course, on a nightly basis, when they were laying the new asphalt, there were trucks going from the asphalt plant through to the airport every night for several months. So you can see, and so we needed a detailed traffic management plan to address those issues. And so the traffic management plan identified a number of zones. So you have it all split up into a number of zones with different requirements in each of the zones, just to make sure everything is covered. And even at the site itself, this is the traffic management plan for the actual site area, to show how, the speeds that vehicles are going to go, the direction of traffic, that sort of thing, where people are posted for, where watches are posted to warn local communities. So here we have the spotter traffic, identifying where the spotter traffic is for the different transport locations. So it's this kind of level of detail we want in these plans, so that it's all very clear. And but we need to, as I say, we need to provide guidance as early as possible to the contractor as to the level of detail that we require. So that's the end of the presentation today. Sorry I've gone over a little bit in time, but happy to take any questions if you have any. Next week we will go into detail on roles and responsibilities and of the supervision team, the contractor, and the regulator, the PMU, and look at monitoring and reporting.
Thanks, Alan. I'm just wondering if everybody else out there, do you have any questions? Everyone? We've got one, I think it's a question from Lavini Tawake. Are these EMP, CEMP public documents or confidential?
Oh no, they're public documents. It's very much public documents. So even the CEMP, I would think. I mean, Jean, do you want to comment on that? Certainly, the EMP is a public document.
Yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, so I totally take the point of view that the CEMP is a public document, and I certainly disclose those on our website once they have been reviewed and cleared. The only things that would not be disclosed is if there was any commercially sensitive information in them. And in my view, that kind of information should not be included in a CEMP in any case. So there's no reason why they can't be made publicly available. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thanks, Jean. Also, many countries have other regulations or laws that requires a public consultation where you open up the documents or notify the public of a particular development proposal that they receive, and that includes also the EMPs. So yes, it's very much public document, but like Jean said, if there are sensitivities, then in terms of private information, that's of course will need to be redacted. Well, any other questions? I don't think there is any at the moment, except some really thank yous to you, Alan, for a very excellent presentation. In fact, I want to join as well. Thank you very much, Alan. It was very clear right from the beginning, and everybody could understand the logic from the various steps of the EMP that you presented upon. And I think the fact that not that many people are asking questions, I think that's a testament to how clear and you were in delivering the contents of your presentation. So I really want to thank you, and I want to ask everybody else to join me in giving you a round of applause, Alan. Alan, just finally, there's some really excellent. I was wondering if you have any sort of templates of the risk assessments that you have, or any other guidance material from ADP that you could share with us, and Ivan can sort of, even if it's a link that Ivan can include in the PNEA. Obviously, we will upload your presentation on the PNEA so the whole community of practice can access them. So if there's any other sort of materials that, in addition to your presentation, that you can provide for folks out there, sure, be easy for them to use at work, that'll be most appreciative. So we've gone over time. Let me thank you, Alan, once again, and remind everybody for your evaluation, please expect a link from Ms. Jill, and hopefully those who complete will get their training presentation. So I want to thank Alan. I want to thank Jean. Thank you very much, Jean, for your help and for organizing Alan's availability. We are very grateful and appreciate. Next week, so we don't have the final two webinars for this year. It will happen not next week, but the following week. So module 15 is on environment and social safeguard provisions and compliance management reporting. And Alan and Jean will be continuing their role to present on that, and looking forward to it. And then straight after that, we'll have the final module, which is module 16. And that will be led by the World Bank on preventing gender-based violence, sexual exploitation and abuse, and sexual harassment in a project environment. So please, everybody, do make sure you you register on Zoom. If you have any difficulties, reach out to Ivan. Other than that, Fa'afetai lava and look after yourself. Fa'afetai.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Take care.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you.
Bye.
So thank you, Greg. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
That's right. Bye.